Well, it's great to be here in conversation with you, Dalia. I'm so excited to get to hear you read a little bit, and then I guess we're going to have a conversation between the two of us, and then we'll open it up to the chat. And you look lovely, by the way. I didn't get to say that earlier.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you too, Jennifer. You've been definitely part of this journey for a long time, and I appreciate your being in conversation with me. So I'm going to read from a part of my novel that's not too deep into the story, but the setup I need to share is essentially, it's from the perspective of a young Egyptian woman who's recently left Cairo sort of impulsively. She's left to the United States with a young man who she's married, and getting to know and getting to understand what her life in her new country is like. Her name is Hala, and this is in the early 1950s. The first time Khalil went to school, I was unprepared for how long he would be gone. Day turned to night, and I began to worry that something had happened to him. Maybe he'd gotten lost or been murdered. I imagined having to carry on without him, figuring out how to survive here on my own. And just as I was really beginning to panic, Khalil came home. It would be like this most days, Khalil explained, estimating that he would have to be on campus about 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In addition to requiring Khalil to be a full-time student, his scholarship stipulated that he assist a professor in his department for 20 hours a week. I sat in silence as I let this information sink in. What was there to say? Khalil gave me a weekly allowance to buy groceries. He assumed I would remember how to get to Steinway from our previous excursion to the commercial boulevard, but he was wrong. I got completely turned around the first couple of times I attempted to explore the neighborhood on my own. I gave up and went back to the apartment following my first attempt. Though our building was huge and ugly, at least it was easy to spot from a distance. The second time I persevered and eventually found the giant grocery store. I spent hours there that first afternoon, walking up and down each aisle, studying all the goods on the shelves and in the refrigerated cases. I encountered fruits and vegetables I'd never seen before. Pears, which looked like oblong, shapely apples with brownish green flesh, bundles of green spears called asparagus, perfect purple plums, which were 25 cents a pound, but I couldn't resist dropping one into my cart anyway, as well as a whole section of produce, including parsnips, rutabaga, and turnips that were completely foreign to me. There were aisles and aisles of canned goods. Cans were a rarity in Rima's kitchen. Beans were the only food I knew of to come from cans. In the butcher's section, all of the meat was pre-cut and packaged with styrofoam and cellophane, unlike the mystery paper-wrapped meats Rima brought home from the butcher. Though tempted to fill my cart with an intriguing collection of discoveries, I put in only the essentials and kept a mental tabulation of the going total so that I would not overspend. I hated the long walk home, laden with heavy bags of groceries. Not only was it burdensome and difficult, but it also made me feel self-conscious, as if I were out on parade in public. It made me think of Rima and how she did this all the time. It took just the smallest of suggestions to bring my thoughts back to her. I'd taken her for granted, not only all of her labors that I'd consciously benefited from, but also her invisible work. With the one pot and single pan Khalil had procured, I prepared dishes I'd watched Rima make over the years. Grape leaves, stuffed cabbage and peppers, pickled eggplant, stewed lentils, dishes from home that were easy to prepare on a budget. I pictured Rima chopping and stirring and frying and baking as I worked in the kitchen, missing her deeply. "You're amazing," Khalil remarked each time he tasted anything. "Where did you learn how to cook like this?" "Rima," I told him again and again, always giving her credit. Every few days, Khalil came home with a random piece of furniture that he'd found on the street. "Can you believe someone was throwing this away?" he remarked one evening, showing off a well-worn vinyl-covered card table that he dragged into the apartment, his face and neck dripping with sweat. "Yes," I wanted to say, but kept quiet. I'd had no real sense of money before, no idea what my father made or how much my family owned, but now I'd become aware of its value and limitations. I knew the amount Khalil got paid every week and how little it amounted to in the commercial world. We had to save to buy the amenities we needed, a couch and a dresser, a couple of chairs to go in the kitchen around the table Khalil had scavenged. Once we acquired the basics, Khalil surprised me one day with a television. I felt like a child on her birthday, receiving a most desired gift. I turned through the dial, sitting on my knees in front of the glowing box. The only television in my parents' house had been in my mother's room, so I never got to watch it. Having my own made me feel like an adult. I began to spend my days in front of the television instead of in bed. Daytime soap operas occupied my attention during the long, lonely hours while Khalil was away. Guiding Light, Search for Tomorrow, Love of Life. Around 3 o'clock, when the programming turned to cartoons and news, I peeled myself off the couch and started cooking. When I knew Khalil wouldn't be home until late, I took a nap instead. One day, when I was going out for groceries, I discovered a pile of thick books in the lobby of our building. I took one off the stack and flipped through the first few pages. It was a telephone directory full of ads and contact information. When I got back from the store, the stack was still there, as towering as when I'd left it. After depositing the groceries upstairs, I returned to the lobby to take a copy. I'd never seen a telephone directory before, and it amazed me what a wealth of information it contained. Could it truly be so easy to find someone's telephone number? And by extension, was it barbaric that we didn't have a telephone and therefore didn't exist as far as this book was concerned? Past the block of yellow pages in the front, I found the personal listings. Scanning the first page of A's, I was surprised to discover a large number of surnames that sounded Arabic in origin. Abbas, Abdullah, Abdul Rahman, Abdul Azim, Abdi, Abdul Nur, Abud. It occurred to me that this might be a way to find other Egyptians, or at least Arabs, potential friends. Khalil kept a jar of change on the dresser in the bedroom where he deposited the coins from his pockets at the end of each day. I grabbed a handful of change and the page featuring the treasure trove of Arabic names, which I ripped out of the telephone book and put what I'd collected in my purse and headed to the phone booth on the corner of our block, which I'd passed by but had never used. I began with the number next to the first Arabic-looking name. A man answered and I hung up. With the next number I tried, the phone rang, and the same with the third. Finally, just as I was about to give up on this foolish initiative, a woman answered. Yes, hello, I said abruptly, losing confidence in my mastery of English. I found your number in the phone book. I coughed to catch my breath. I just moved here from Egypt and I was looking for friends. The woman at the other end laughed. Ya aini, she cried, switching to Arabic and using an old familiar phrase that made me think of Rima. That's brilliant. We agreed to meet the next day. She lived in Far Rockaway, and when it became evident that I had no idea where that was, she offered to come to me. I suggested we meet at a diner on Steinway that I'd seen, the only establishment whose name came to me then. I showed up early and secured a small table near the front of the restaurant. When Melek walked in the door, I knew it was her. She looked like an Egyptian movie star, coiffed and made up like my mother. I waved meekly when she looked in my direction, feeling like a child compared to her, realizing that I was, in fact, still a child in many ways. Oh, Habibti, she cooed familiarly as I stood and we embraced. Melek did most of the talking, telling me an abbreviated version of her life story. Married off to the son of Palestinian immigrants in New York at 17, a mother for the first time at 18 and then again at 20. She'd bled so much after her second birth that the doctors had sterilized her on the spot, damming up her fallopian tubes. No matter, she said, recounting this cheerily. I would have liked a daughter, but at least my husband got his sons. It amazed me how open she was. When she asked me questions about myself, I was reluctant to share much, on the contrary. Yes, I answered when she asked if I was happy here. Yes to the question of whether I planned to have children. Yes, when she asked if I was in touch with my parents, though of course that was a lie, and this made me tear up, which she noticed. Are you okay, she asked. Forgive me, she said. My husband always says I'm too nosy. I shook my head and took a sip of my ice water. We should do this again, Melek said when we were done with our coffees. The bill came and she paid. I knew it would be up to me to reach out to her since we had no phone at the apartment. And I knew, even as I agreed with her suggestion, that I wasn't likely to call her again anytime soon. It seemed that we'd exhausted the possibilities of what to talk about during our brief encounter, and were in such different places in our lives. I was a young runaway who didn't want to share anything about herself, and she was a respectable mother of 2 children who maintained relationships with her family back home. I kept the folded page of the telephone directory at the bottom of my purse, where the thin paper ripped and smudged, degrading over time. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. I feel like it's always so anticlimactic on Zoom to just have the like silence after that. But hooray, yay, that was wonderful. It was so great to hear that section read aloud. I love how it is bookended with these two like hugely disorienting, immigrant experiences, like the novelty of being at a grocery store, which I feel like is such a sort of iconic experience anytime you're somewhere new, like going to the grocery store and seeing what's different, and then that sort of heartbreaking idea of like looking through the phone book and finding the name and having this connection. It's beautiful. Thank you. So I have a few questions for you. I guess the first 3 maybe are sort of just about the book itself, and sort of some of the themes at work in the book. And then I have a couple of questions sort of more about just the process and sort of the journey towards publication, et cetera. So I guess I'll start with, I don't think it'll be giving away too much to say that mental illness is a theme in this book, and I, as a reader, am so struck by sort of the subtlety and the empathy with which you depict mental illness. You sort of suggest diagnoses for characters at certain points, but you certainly never let those diagnoses define the characters. You never kind of give us the sense that we have their number completely because we know this one thing about them. And so I would love to hear a little bit about how you thought about that, about sort of the depiction of mental illness in your work, and how you managed to sort of thread it through at least 2 characters' sort of identities and journeys in this way that felt so sort of organic to character, sort of character up, I suppose, rather than like mental illness down. And certainly be interested in hearing about any opportunities or sort of challenges that you encountered along the way.
Sure, thanks for that reading. Part of the ambition when I set out to write this book as a multi-generational novel was to trace some of these things that are inherited from one generation to the next. Definitely some of the, I guess, sort of trauma that accompanies being, leaving home and like starting fresh in a new place, but also the mental illness thread, which you mentioned, which is more explicit in the more contemporary sections of the book, as it was and has been in our culture more recently. And so that was really part of the thinking behind how to portray it in the book, with the generation, with the character in the 50s who's most likely dealing with some sort of mental health crisis. There's no language for it. There's not recognition for it among her family or friends or her culture. And that was part of, honestly, my interest in investigating that too, just the lack of really thinking about how it manifests in culture in general, but certainly in Arab culture and Arab American culture, and the sort of stigma around it, and wanting to really explore its reality in a character from that background. So when I decided to sort of invest the narrative with that thread, with this character who is most likely dealing with manifestations of bipolar disorder, because I couldn't really put language around it and there wouldn't be people around her that were talking about it, I had to have a lot of that sort of come through retrospectively. And so that was something that I worked on so the book is essentially structured in these long sections, which is maybe something we'll talk about later. But the first section is all devoted to this character whose perspective I read from, and that carries almost half of the book, and it's in the first person. And that's something I landed on structurally later on in my process. But once the POV switches to other characters, they do a lot of work in terms of illuminating some aspects of the mystery of Hala's life that we may not have been privy to from her perspective.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to hear you talk about that. I sort of love the way you're saying, like, you're even though you're the author and you're sort of like the god of the book, you're kind of hedging, like saying like she probably has that. Like, I love that. I just think there's such humility in that, of sort of saying like, yes, I created these characters, but even I don't, know everything about them in some way. And I feel there's a really kind of beautiful ambiguity sort of laced through the book that comes out in how you're talking about that. It's really interesting. And it's so interesting too to hear you talk about how, like, yeah, of course, like as a Western reader, I sort of feel like I can, that I have a name for this disease sort of suggested to me in my own mind, but it's really interesting to see how, yes, of course, like the paradigm, the way that these symptoms, the way that she's experiencing is made meaning of, for her and in her own life is sort of different from that. And yeah, I think it's really an interesting, it's such an interesting through line in the book. Another aspect of the book that I was really curious in asking you about a little bit is, just the kind of the great challenge of writing, as you said, this kind of multi-generational, sort of almost an epic, against the backdrop of also this, highly dynamic kind of political and historical backdrop, of Egypt, certainly from the 50s through the 80s we see. So I was really curious to hear you talk a little bit about that, the research aspect, but also just the challenge of writing characters whose storylines in some cases really intersect with the kind of political, social, historical trajectory of Egypt. And then in other cases, less so. In other cases, you have characters who kind of are living lives that feel sort of less politically inflected. So any thoughts about that or about the research process on that would be so interesting to hear about.
Sure. I definitely, at the outset, Egypt in some ways was a character, and Egypt specifically in this moment. It wasn't actually where the point of entry where the book begins now in the 1950s is not where I originally began when I began drafting the book years ago, but I found my way there, and it felt like a very natural expansion point for the story that I was telling, because it was essentially, it opens in 1952 while Cairo is burning, essentially. It's protests, anti-British protests against British rule. And so it's the beginning of a revolution that is successful, and that the landscape in Egypt changes entirely. So that point, that moment where Egypt goes from being occupied to being to no longer being controlled by the British, to being independent, was kind of the starting point of my interest for the scope of this story. And I was curious to set a young woman against that backdrop in order to highlight essentially how, while everything is changing in the world around her and in the streets, in fact, her life is becoming more confined because of the riots and the sort of perceived danger in the city at that moment. She's pulled out of school she's in high school, and she's pulled out of school, and she's really becomes more of a prisoner in her home. So I think I'm still kind of answering your question, but essentially just that personal history as pitted against a political history was part of the driving force of like how I wanted to cast her story and sort of send her off on a journey that then would percolate, or would then like pass down through the generations. In terms of research, I mean, I think it's, like any writer like yourself, or like anybody who writes anything set in a historical moment, it's just like you approach it like coursework, and find as many sources as you can to illuminate the history and really kind of like internalize and metabolize it as much as you can. So I ended up learning a lot more about Egyptian history in the second half of the 20th century than ultimately served my book, although at times I did try to sort of pull in elements that were not necessarily necessary to the plot. And that was part of the revision process, is just kind of letting go of those things that were not essential and did not move the drama forward. But it was a little painful. It's like, you learn all these things and in your research and you want to include all these wonderful details, but at times, especially when I have characters going back and forth between Egypt and the US, it doesn't make a lot of sense if drama in Egypt is not central to their lives at a particular moment in the narrative. It couldn't really serve the novel in terms of its forward momentum. So I did like I said, a lot of research just with books, but I also am a very visual person. I work in an art museum. I love photographs. I've spent a lot of time with photographs. I think that they really helped me deepen my relationship with the history as well, just in terms of like in an imaginative way, just the way that archival photos, let's say of Cairo in the 1950s can really help you imagine yourself into the moment, into the place, but also they can illuminate, some really good concrete details that help make the writing really sing and make it more authentic. And and I also, as you know, I wrote a couple of essays for poets and writers. I did a lot of listening to Egyptian, or actually broadly Middle Eastern music from the middle of the 20th century, in terms of like the way it could evoke a mood and sort of put me into a headspace of trying to write about this cultural moment.
Yeah, and I have a question for you about the following up on sort of the photographs and just the sort of visual, aspect of the writing, which of course naturally is such a strength of yours. But to just respond quickly to your comment about like having all this amazing research, and then that sort of, I mean, I've been there myself, where like you have all of this amazing stuff and you want to sort of get all of it in, but then you can't, because you want to sort of avoid that like Forrest Gump effect of like the person just is stumbling constantly over these like really iconic figures. But I really think that you did such a great job with that, because I think one of the things that's so interesting and feels to me to be so true about the book is that you, again, not to give too much away, but you have one character whose life is like very profoundly impacted by political realities in this grave way, and then you have other people where it's much more oblique, and their sort of awareness or their thinking about that is sort of more patchy. You talk about Amina's Hala's sort of the way that gender kind of intersects with this moment of upheaval, and then also the way kind of class like factors into her experience with Khalil, and all of that I think is done so organically. And so whatever you did, I think it worked out well. I empathize though with the struggle of having to having like really delicious research that then you have to kind of just excise. But yeah,
I've seen a more Forrest Gumpy version at some point in the progression of this. I feel like you might have seen a more Forrest Gumpy version. That's a funny analogy, and I think it's very true.
Yeah, it is funny, especially since I've actually never seen Forrest Gump, but I'm given to understand that he just sort of meets, just like a litany of celebrities of the era. So yeah, to go back, I mean, of course, like, it's interesting, like reading about Amina as her, sort of science arts blending. I couldn't help but think about you as this like writer artist person who has these kind of two sections of your brain that I think we see kind of so beautifully sort of wedded together in this book. And you spoke already some about the role of photography for you in terms of thinking in terms of being able to sort of visualize what you're writing about in terms of your research process. But I was just curious to hear, maybe you talk a little bit more about the role of those visual moments of a real kind of incongruous beauty sometimes in Amina's section in particular. Like, I don't want to give away too much, but certainly sort of the section with the butterflies, the sections with the ants, and some of the other sort of visual moments of sort of ritual in her life were so interesting. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about sort of how you sort of brought those sort of visual aspect, like how you wrote those sections, but how you wrote them sort of in consideration of this character in particular, because she more than the others, I think, seems to have that really kind of visually attuned mind, and it's one of the great things you do to differentiate your characters, because you do have 4 points of view. So does that make sense of the question? Just talk about imagery, Dalia.
Sure. Yeah, she's as a young woman and really starting in college, although she has like an aptitude for science and follows that path for a while, she discovers a real passion for visual art. And so she's coming up and kind of coming into that consciousness in like the late 60s, early 70s. So I was able to have some fun thinking about what kind of art she may have been exposed to and what kind of gestures she may have made that weren't necessarily artistic in their intent early on, but could be construed again with this like kind of retrospective look. Like, oh, well, that maybe was when she really began expressing herself as a creative person. Although she wouldn't have defined herself as an artist like there. And I don't think this gives anything away, but there is a section of the book when she's a teenager and is just really trying to get rid of some things that have a lot of emotional charge for her that are just kind of reopening old wounds as she's surrounded by them. And so she engages in this sort of artful distribution of these objects around New York City. And that was a lot of fun to think about, especially the part where she goes to Roosevelt Island, which I lived in New York for years, but actually had never visited, but it was always fascinated, just sort of passing it over it. And if I would go over ground, if I'd go over a bridge between Manhattan and Queens or vice versa. And so actually one time my brother used to live on the Upper East Side. And when I visited him, I did actually make my first trip to Roosevelt Island and got to really imagine myself into that landscape, and in particular into like this defunct smallpox hospital. It had multiple functions over the years, but it was one of these islands where essentially the city's outcasts were sent over the course of decades and maybe even centuries. But yeah, then the narrative moves more explicitly into looking at land art, which is definitely a hybrid of, in a lot of ways, of art and nature, if not science. And I haven't experienced a ton of destination art in my experience. I've been to West Texas and seen the Donald Judd landscape pieces. I've seen a lot of James Turrell sky spaces. I was in my job at the Blanton. I helped work on this chapel that the artist Ellsworth Kelly built. So I'd had for a long time a real interest in artworks that are essentially realized outside of the museum space and how that kind of transforms the experience of the person who comes upon them. I just had an event in New York with my friend Emily Hall, who just published her debut, which is all about art. And we were having this conversation a little bit, and then she said something so lovely about James Turrell, who I just mentioned, who's building this sort of opus called Rodin Crater. And I guess he once said that really the journey to Rodin Crater, or the experience of it, starts the minute you leave your door. And I just love that sense of like when you decide to go and visit one of these artworks, which, I mean, some people will just like, that is their goal, and going to see like Spiral Jetty, by Robert Smithson, or DeMaria's Lightning Fields, that it's there. The whole trip is about seeing that work of art and experience it in the landscape. And so there's like a large engagement with land art that comes later in the book. And then this piece that you referred to with the ants is essentially like a large site specific ant farm that they build, which is really just, it's inspired by not directly by an individual work of art, but really by trying to merge some of these questions that came up in Amina's science career, and sort of the evolution of insects over generations, and metaphorically how that can speak to sort of the intergenerational stuff that happens among humans in the story. I think that's kind of a long-winded response. And I might not have even talked about the visual details, but except for Roosevelt Island.
No, it's fascinating. I'm always so fascinated to hear you talk about art and all of that. I thought was so fascinating and wise. And yeah, that section on Roosevelt Island was the part I was sort of trying to allude to without going into too much detail, like that sort of ritualistic feel of it. And I love how, yeah, it's like the way you called it, like a gesture, like it's this creative gesture that she wouldn't have necessarily called art, and it sort of presages her, that part of her identity. But it also kind of looks crazy, like, like it could also come across as nuts. And I love that. I love how it's something that feels like it could be connected to both of those parts of her or neither. And like also just it also speaks a little bit to how like a lot of what we do creatively looks a little bonkers from the outside in. You know what I mean? Like, what are you, it's like when you're writing, voices in your head. It's like, what do you do? Not to be too glib about it, but I actually think it's kind of profound and interesting, that link that sometimes exists between those parts of people's selves. And it's just interesting to think about that moment of ritual for her, which doesn't have a name, that feels potentially connected to both of those threads. I don't know. So yeah, you mentioned already some about sort of the structural aspects of the book, how it's written in 4 POVs, one big first person chunk and then followed by 3 third person, right? So yeah, I mean, I have a couple questions for you about sort of just the craft process. I mean, if you want to talk a little bit about the journey of structuring it, and then the thing I was interested in hearing a little bit about was either which parts or which POVs maybe were kind of most challenging for you, and versus which parts sort of came the most easily. I'm always curious to hear that.
Sure, I'll try to bundle that all together. The book was definitely sort of born of my fascination with these characters. And for a long time, like I knew the cast of characters long before I kind of knew how to structure the book. The structure was the biggest struggle, I would say. I mean, I had the sort of the characters and the world building and some aspects of what I knew would happen to them in this sort of like grand arc, sort of set in my mind for a long time. But figuring out how to keep the narrative lively and how to keep engaged with these different characters was the probably, there were numerous struggles, but that was probably the biggest struggle of working on this book. And for a long time, I set out to do this kind of structure where you follow each character, like you basically shorter sections from different points of view that rotate more rapidly, like every 10 to 20 pages, and sort of seeing like Khalil and Hala, for example, who are a couple and they come up together in Egypt around the same time. For a long time, I felt loyal to sort of portraying their journeys in parallel, but the narrative, I think, definitely got stilted. And some books do it incredibly well. Sometimes I do feel like, I feel a little too jostled when I move between POVs. So I think it really depends on how you can keep the momentum going when you're juggling different characters. But with all of my revisions, I started kind of fresh. I mean, it's not like I didn't look at what I had before, but I sort of let myself try to figure out like how to start it again, how to find a new way in and a new opening. And a few years ago, probably 3-4 years ago, I decided to really let myself sit with characters for a little longer than I had over the previous years and the previous versions of the book. And that's when it really felt like it was working better structurally, and like I could really create more of kind of like a literary momentum or page turner kind of, feeling, less kind of upsetting, I think, from the reader perspective, in terms of just jumping back and forth and having to get realigned all the time. So it turned into more sections that are like novella-like in shape, which some of my favorite books that were inspirations to me early on followed that structure, like Zadie Smith's NW or Colin McCann's Let the Great World Spin. So in some ways, I'm kind of kicking myself for not just trying that at the outset, but each process is individual and you arrive at it however you can. And I also was inspired by books that switch POVs rapidly and they work really well. But in terms of the ones that were easiest to write, the sections we were talking about in the previous question, that are from Amina and the perspective of somebody who's trying to figure out her identity and is really starting to see herself as an artist in the world. Those were the first sections I wrote. And while they're not me, they're the closest to some of my experiences, and certainly closer to the time and place where I grew up, time and places where I grew up. And so that her voice was always quite natural to me. Trying to figure out the characters that precede her, the previous generation, had the challenges of just trying not to be anachronistic and trying to be true to kind of mentalities of an earlier time. I'd say that the most challenging parts to write were, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, the ones from the male perspectives. Especially, there's one character who is a war veteran where I just felt, and when I was writing that in the narrative present, I was just like, this is so challenging, and I don't really have, I don't know, it felt like I was writing on a soundstage or something. Like it just wasn't really working. I didn't have any sort of, not only not no lived experience, but not even like a great interest in like war dramas. Like I don't watch war movies, so I mean I did to some degree, just to kind of like pick up some details for feel and experience. But once I was able to cast that into the backstory, I was able to really kind of shrink it down, and hopefully it worked better. But I found those sections really challenging, sort of like the political history of this male character who is a veteran and goes to war and is part of the political machine briefly. And then there's also sections in the Egyptian prison system, which luckily I have no experience with personally, but also something that took a lot of imagination. And I mean, I was able to do some research, but certainly it's probably 2 parts imagination, 1 part research, just because I don't have access to those spaces.
I wondered about that. Yeah.
The stories that was actually some of the early kind of tidbits that got me interested in writing that part of the story, came most directly from sort of family narratives that I'd been collecting for many years and since childhood, and since I started traveling to Egypt as a young person, and just was really fascinated with the culture and the history of my family members and others. But my mother has a couple of great uncles that were incarcerated during moments of like political consolidation and regime change, sort of consolidations of power. And one that particularly fascinated me, from what I understand, I don't know him very well, but from what I understand from family members, he was like, his religion was really politics. When he went into prison and he came out a devout Muslim, and that was an arc that I found really fascinating and wanted to explore from a fictional perspective. But those sections were definitely very challenging to write.
I can imagine it would be. Yeah, so I guess the Q&A, I guess you can, if you have questions for Dalia, you can put them in the chat. I can ask a couple of more too, but certainly don't mean to be hogging her if other people have questions. But I would ask you too, like, I'm always curious to know, what you were writing this book for quite a while, right? I'm trying to remember, I don't remember how long.
15 years.
It's okay. So over that time, what would you say kind of surprised you most about either the process or about something you figured out about your characters eventually, or something that kind of came up in the plot? Like, is there anything that you can think of that was like surprising to you?
I think it was sort of, yes, it was a long process, 15 years. And like I was saying earlier, it was the initial kind of engine was these characters, and trying to find those, like the web that makes it like cohesive and makes it more of a novel, these points of intersection. That those were like the discoveries in the writing process. Like when I was able to kind of make one character's arc align with another, that without, I don't want to give away too much, but essentially those moments, I think, where I was able to figure out how to kind of keep the energy, like not only with one character, but try to like revive another character, like on the page, or like through this sort of ghost-like, in a ghost-like fashion. And so just writing those scenes and sort of discovering ways that I could create these conversations across generations and across characters were the kind of biggest and best surprises. And I think ultimately what, allowed me to bring it all together.
Mm-hmm. And that's always so satisfying too, right? Like when you can feel those like things clicking together, or suddenly like in dialogue and in ways that you haven't seen before. Yeah, and then I guess I don't know if you think this question is annoying or not. Tell me after I ask you. I always think I have I don't have a response to this. I get it all the time, and I don't have a good answer. So now I'm going to inflict it on you. Did you get any like advice that you found to be really sustaining, like writing advice over the course of the process of writing this book?
That is a hard question, Jennifer.
Terrible question, but it's like it would be answers. It would be so useful to people, but
Yeah,
okay if you
I
don't.
would say I definitely got a lot of great advice, through different versions of this book that I shared with other writers, including yourself. But I would say somebody once told me that I had to be able to I was always challenged to tell the story of the story succinctly. And it would just sort of spiral into like, well, it's about this and this, and it's about a lot of things, and and it's complicated. But to just find at least like a through line, like what is the story, like what's kind of finding that North Star, and just as a way to kind of like always rein the narrative back in if it's diverging too much, or if it's just kind of getting unwieldy or out of one's control. That was great advice. I mean, and then there's just like some of the first advice I learned in writing workshops about just engaging the five senses. And that's something I still have to kind of force myself to think about when I write, but I think it's what makes the writing really rich sometimes, because I feel like I can just have a tendency to get into sort of the cerebral space of just cataloging a character's thoughts, but not necessarily be grounded in the physical world, which is maybe an indication of who I am as a human being too. But I just, just especially when trying to evoke a place, a time and place, it's so important to tap into those sensory details. And it's a great way to just kind of, to just situate characters and scenes. And so that, and, just read, which is something that we're always, it's the best advice for any writer, I think, but it's the best teacher, is just to read as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too how you deploy the five senses, but I think the different characters, which is so true for people, like have slightly different. Like when I remember the different POVs, I think about like the beautiful sort of imagery in Amina's sections and sort of her visual like attention, which of course makes sense, and then I think of Hassan's sections as very like tactile in a certain way, which sort of makes sense too. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I think they're all there throughout, but there's also that way in which, like, of course, and with Hala and Amina too, like you can sort of feel their nervous systems like rev up and down a little bit, and it's interesting because of course people also have like are more or less attentive to various things or think of things in different terms, and I think that's part of how you kind of differentiate these characters and make them sort of feel distinctive throughout this continuity and this sort of North Star that you talk about. That's about all I had. Do people in the chat have chats?
I have not received any questions yet, so this is my last opportunity to open it up to our audience members, which we do have quite a few of. If any of you have questions, feel free to submit them. If I get any questions, I'll let y'all know, but y'all can just keep interviewing. It's been a lovely conversation so far.
Dalia, I know that some of the people in your chat are your relatives. Do you want to be calling any of them out by name? And
I did see. I feel like that's a good part of the audience. It's nice because my parents have been able to join one of my events in person, but my brother and sister-in-law, who I saw, just joined. Yeah, they haven't been able to. I guess I'll say this is not about you. No, that's something that has been asked in other contexts and other interviews. Just how. Are there characters or are there storylines that really are taken like from life, or is it really just all fiction? Which I think, most work is sort of a collage of those things. But yeah, I mentioned the great uncles, the kind of prison narrative that did feed in, but otherwise I think that the characters are really just like sort of inventions, that came about through the process of writing this book. I've joked a couple of times at these events that my dad read it for the first time recently, and he was like, there's not a lot of like warm, loving family relationships in these pages. And, I had to remind him it was not about our warm and loving family, but rather a more interesting and revved up fictional take on family.
So Dalia, I do have a question from a viewer. They love hearing you talk about art, and they were wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between your work at the Blanton and your writing.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I've been working in the visual art world for my whole career. And the past 10 years I've been at the Blanton. And as you mentioned when you introduced me, I was at the Museum of Modern Art before, and otherwise I've worked in galleries and foundations. But I did mention sort of my work on this Ellsworth Kelly project and how it really solidified or kind of codified my interest in like writing about destination art, although in some ways that was a part of the narrative earlier on. But I think just being around art is just a wonderful thing for a writer or an artist to do. And I think that in terms of like also talking about, how most writers and artists have day jobs, that it's very rare to be able to support oneself on, books or art, and to find, like for me, I feel like I found a job that really feeds my soul and it really inspires me and is sort of a constant reminder of the varieties of artistic expression, and that there are like no rules or formulas or just one way to do things. It's just like sort of constant inspiration. And I was asked at the event in New York the other night if there were like specific artworks that I felt like I was trying to make my novel like, and I still don't have a direct answer to that, but I do think that there's like a sort of emotional response that is evoked by certain artworks that is something akin to what I want to do in my fiction. So it's more like I want to make people feel a certain way, the way that like a certain artwork or another book can make people feel a certain way. So I think constantly being in a situation where you're exposed to those, opportunities to be moved by art, it's certainly fed me, my creative spirit, and my writing for sure. I also think that it's good for me to have a separation between the art that I'm trying to make and the art that I work with every day. I think it would be, at least for me personally, really challenging to be an administrator like in the literary art world as opposed to the visual art world, just in terms of like, I don't know, just keeping a little bit of distance and also staying a little bit away from the business of it. I mean, not that you can stay too far away from the business of it if you're trying to do either, but just, I think for the psyche, it's good to have a little separation.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about like how the being around visual art. I mean, I'm going to be sloppily misparaphrasing what you just said about how like something along the lines of it shows you like all these different ways for art to be, right? Like I think that's so interesting. I mean, even just hearing you talk about like the destination art and like that idea of like as soon as you leave the door to go, like that's part of the art, and like that's really a different, I mean, I teach an MFA program, and I read a lot, and I read a lot of different kinds of fiction all the time, and that always feels very nourishing to me. Like I'm constantly kind of re-encountering what narrative can be. But it's so cool and interesting to think about like the kinds of art that exist beyond narrative, because that's like right there, that's just like mind-blowing to me, that idea that like, yeah, like just like the intentional journey to go and like consume art would be part of the experience of art. And there's just stuff that like exists in the physical realm that isn't replicable, in text. And so yeah, it's interesting. I don't have any brain for it, but it's like very fascinating to me to hear you discuss it.
Thank you.
We have any other questions from the people?
Not so far. Is there anything you all haven't covered that you want to cover? Because we're nearing the end of the hour.
Dalia, do you want to tell us anything about what's next for you or what you're working on?
Sure. I have a project that is on pause that I began working on a little while ago, and definitely at different moments when I felt like I needed a break from country of origin and just needed a little bit of space from it. I want to write a work of historical fiction also in Egypt, but in the 30s, but from the perspective actually of an archaeologist and his family that are there, and an American archaeologist and his family that are there in the 30s at this time when that was sort of, those were the people, it was foreign companies doing the work of excavation throughout Egypt and sort of making discoveries, but also taking a lot of those discoveries back home, which was totally above board according to the rules and regulations of the time, where findings that were funded by foreign companies were meant to be split 50-50 with Egypt, although nothing of major importance was supposed to be taken out, while in actuality things were. So it's that, like, the things that weren't supposed to be taken out part that I want to explore, and sort of the dynamics between local populations and Western populations coming in to contact around these digs in sort of the height of that moment.
I'm super excited about it. Sounds great.
Well, thank you.
I would ask you more follow-up questions, but I feel like I don't want to put you on the spot about it.
It's about all I know so far.
Context. Situation. Did you have a take on the Roman head that was found at Goodwill in
That is so interesting.
That's a great question.
I don't, except I don't know, have a good sense of what you have before you drop it off at Goodwill. Maybe have an appraiser look at it, or
my question,
your art museum friend.
You think you'd know? Because like Justin and I were talking about this the other night. I was like, there's no way I would be able to tell that that was like some authentic. Like I would never know. I guess she had some experience. So
I don't think I would be able to tell. I mean, I think that if it had like a real substantial kind of materiality, I might wonder.
yeah,
It didn't feel like some kind of chintzy plastic thing, but other than that, no, not. I can't authenticate works from that era. Definitely not.
right. Okay, I think that's about all I had question wise, but
Great. I mean, we are at the top of the hour in terms of the interview. So Dalia and Jennifer, thank you for joining us on At Home with Literati tonight. And thanks to our viewers as well. Make sure you buy the book. The link is in the chat, on the event listing, under the YouTube video. And of course, you can always contact our store to purchase a copy. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you at the next event. Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.